Hey, what's going on, guys? So I wanted to put together some quick notes on the construction and components of a basic C program to get us started, and I'll go into more detail as our class progresses. But wanted to get through some important points to make sure that everyone understands how a C program is constructed, and some of these ideas also translate to other programming languages, but we'll just kind of focus on C at this time since that's the language we're going to cover in this course. So first and foremost, if you look at this, the text editor that I'm using, this is Notepad++. As I've mentioned in the classroom announcements, you should never ever use Word to write any kind of code. And I would also advise against using Notepad for a number of reasons. But so I'll show you some of the advantages of Notepad++. One is up here at the top you have a ton of options that allow you to compose some pretty elaborate code. But if you go to languages, if I can go to languages, go to C, and choose C programming language, you'll notice that the color of our code changed quite a bit. So this is color coded. The green is typically comments or lines of code that are not going to be compiled or not going to be interpreted by the compiler. So, and then we have some other components that are going to be really important, and it's really important that you understand the function of all of these through the duration of this course, and understand how to use them. So first and foremost, we have an include statement. So the include statement and this define statement, those are both preprocessor commands. So effectively what that does, that kind of lays a foundation for the rest of the code to work around. So these the include statement, it brings in H files or header files, and effectively what that does is it brings in a list of commands or functions that our C program can use. For instance, in this case, the stdio or standard IO, that is going to bring in the printf and the scanf functions into our C program, and we can use those without a problem. So there are other H files or header files that we can take a look at. So for instance, this is just a few of the header files that are available in C. So if you look at the stdio, which as I mentioned is standard IO or standard input and output, if we take a look at that, it kind of gives an explanation of the header file and what's in it. And if we scroll down a little bit, we'll see that we have a number of functions that are available, and to include scanf and printf. So if we go back once, let's take a look at the math H file. Where did I see? There it is. So these are the common math functions. Come on. So this might actually come in handy for you later in the class. So it has a lot of math functions to include square root, which is something that you might use, but it also has sine and cosine and some other useful functions that you might use later on. Not necessarily in this class, but maybe in the follow-on C class. So as I mentioned, the define statement defines a variable that can be used throughout the code, and that variable, even though it's called a variable, is a constant. It will not change throughout the duration of the code. So, and effectively what that means is that you can't change it. Hence the term constant. But so in terms of variables, there are a few variables that we'll demonstrate. The first are called global variables, and in this case we have two integer variables that are called cur age and no years. And so these are global, which means that they can be accessed and modified in any function within this program. And we'll talk about functions here in just a minute. But in addition to the global variables, we also have local variables. And a local variable means that it is local to that function that it lives in. So, in other words, when that function goes away, when it is no longer in existence, that variable also goes away. So now the main function is not going to be a good example, because that main function is active throughout the duration of the program while the program is executing. However, if you have other functions down below, and you have a variable defined in that function, when that function exits, that variable goes away. So in other words, you cannot pass a variable that is defined in the function to another function or to the main function. And we'll talk more about that later. But one important note that I want to make, and you'll need to keep this in mind when you're writing your programs. Now, a lot of the examples that we have in class have single letter variables A, B, and C, or X, Y, and Z. Do not use single letter variables in this class. The variable names are very, very important, and they'll become more important as our programs get longer. So we want to make sure that that the variable name has meaning. So when I say that, don't just use variable 1 and variable 2 to stay away from the single letter variable. It has to have meaning. So in this case, I have two integer variables that are called cur age and no years. So cur age is going to be the current age, which is, like I said, has meaning, and then no years is going to be number of years. So one other important note is that variables all have data types, and you must define a variable before you can use it anywhere in your code. So what happens is, when you define a variable, in this case we have two variables of cur age and no years, that program will go out and allocate areas in memory big enough to hold that variable, and it will define that piece of memory as that data type. So in other words, if you define something as cur age, and then you try to put a string into that variable location, it's not going to work. It's going to give you an error. So that's another important note. So like I said, the variables have to be defined before they're used, and the variable names have to have meaning. So we talked about functions, and every C program is going to have at least one function, and the one function it must have is the main function. So there are certain elements of a function that should be pointed out early in this class. So we have the function name, in this case is main, and then down here we have one that's called calc year. So main is the title of the function, and void in this case is the value that's going into the function. So of course the main function in this case has no value going into it, but if you look down here under the calc year function, we have an integer value called cur age that is the value coming into that function, and that function will use that value to make some calculation or modification. Another important note is the data type of the function, and in this case, actually in both cases, these are integer functions. So that means that we must return a value of an integer value from that function. So in this case, we are returning a 0. Now that's something very, very common in C programming. The main function is typically an integer type function, and you will return a value typically 0. And again, in this case, we have an int, and this is what must be coming out of that function. So in this case, we're going to return the result of drinking age which we see up here is a value of 21, minus a cur value, which again we see up here is an integer value. So the result of this mathematic function, cur age minus drinking age minus cur age, will be returned to whatever area called it. So getting back to our main function, as I've indicated, we already have a local variable that we've defined, and then we have functions inside this functions that have been defined in our stdio h file. Inside this function, the printf function will print some text out to the screen. In this case, it's printing instruction for the user. So this is telling user to enter their name, and of course that's going to be a string of 50 characters. That's a maximum of 50 characters in this case. So the next function that we have is a scanf. So one very important note is that you can only use one scanf function per value coming in. So in other words, you can't have a printf that says enter your name and age and then have scanf and have an s value or a string identifier and a decimal identifier and bring those values in. It has to be one scan function per incoming value. So all right, so we have some statements and expressions that are going on up here, and then we have another variable that has already been defined. This is a global variable, of course, and we see that we are trying to set some value to this global variable. So we're going to call our function that's called calcYear and pass our cur age global variable to that external function. And of course, the result of that, this return statement, will go into this no years variable. So let's take a look at that. So no years is going to equal the function. So we call the function at this point and we carry cur age down with it. So we get to this function, and you'll see that the cur age is an integer value, integer variable, and so it will return the result of drinking age, which is 21 minus cur age. So if the user enters their name and then enters a value of 18, is going to subtract 18 from 21 and return that value up here to no years, and it's going to enter that value into that memory location. And then finally we're going to have a printf that's going to print the values of these variables that we had with in a sentence. And so let's take a look at how that works. All right, so this is an IDE, an online compiler that you can use, and as I've mentioned in some of the correspondence, there is no need for you to buy or install any type of compiler on your machine at home, unless you want to do that. I mean, it's not necessary when we have this tools like this that are available and free online. So the examples that are provided in the classroom, the lab exercises, recommends using the IDE1 website. I don't particularly care for this one. I prefer the C compiler through Tutorials Point. So let's take a look at both of these and see how they work. Now, in both cases, now Tutorials Point has several different programming IDEs, just like IDE1 does, and you want to make sure that you're using the right programming language. So in this case, you'll see that the default for this is Java. So we need to click on Java and go to C, and it'll give you a sample program here. So let's go back to to the text editor that we have, and we'll copy that code. And so now one important point is that remember that this program is going to expect input values. So we can go down here to stdin and put our input values of the string of for a name, in this case Tony, and an integer value of 18 for age. And we will run that. So now this first result is not the best. I mean, you can't edit your code if you need to from this point. So what I typically like to do is the first time I run it, just go ahead and click Edit. Okay, so you'll see that the output here, it's asking for enter your name, and it went out and grabbed the name from the input, which is Tony, and then enter your current age, and it went back to the input and grabbed the next value, which is an integer value of 18, which is what it's expecting. And the result is Tony is 18 years old and will be 21 in 3 years. So that's kind of cool. So let's add some new lines in this code. And run that again and see what happens. All right, so it is basically puts everything on a new line, which is what that execution sequence does. Is the /n is for new line, and there are other execution sequences like /t is for tab. So that is basically the components of a C program, and that's I mean that should get you started. And again, as we start covering new concepts, I will put together some new information and hopefully put together some new videos and have that out to you. So in the meantime, if you have any questions, please let me know. Post that in the Ask the Professor area of the classroom, and we'll get your questions answered. All right, thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it.